Welcome to More Than a Broker, the podcast that goes beyond the traditional definition of a logistics provider. My name is Andrew Elsener, co-founder of Spot. In each episode, we will dive into the stories of industry experts, keep you up to date on the highs and lows of the logistics marketplace, and introduce you to the people behind the advanced technologies that are driving innovation for brokers, shippers, and carriers within our industry. Join us as we explore the world of logistics through a different lens. This is More Than a Broker.
Drivers, start your engines!
There's a question I love to ask people. I was a biochemist and then got into freight transportation, started a company. So how in the heck did you get into transport? I know you were a civil engineer, right?
Yeah. So Andrew, thanks. It's great to be here. Yeah, I took a circuitous path. When I graduated from college in '84, the word supply chain hadn't been coined yet. Logistics was still only in the military, and freight transportation was very far from what I was doing. But I went to a military school, Virginia Military Institute, as a civil engineer, structural engineer predominantly, went into the Army, and I was in Germany in the 80s. And so I was building airfields. And so I did heavy construction. And then when I came back, I knew I wanted to get out. And so I went to get a master's degree, went to UT Austin, studied under T. Michael Walton. So then I decided to do freight transportation, but then I didn't want to build roads anymore, because if you build a road, you're working for the government. I didn't want to do that. So I flipped and went to say, well, what if I operate on the roads? And so that's how I got into transportation, came up to MIT to get my PhD because I wanted to get that for whatever reason. And I worked with Dr. Yossi Sheffi, and he kind of led me on the way of freight transportation. So instead of being a civil engineer building the roads, the question that I tried to work on is, how do you best operate on the roads? And instead of passenger transport, which is what a lot of transportation engineering is about, we did just freight. So how does trucking work? And remember, this is 1992, so deregulation is still fresh in people's mind, and they're still figuring it out. It's only 12 years after dereg. So I kind of came in backdoor through freight transportation through my civil engineering background that way. So it wasn't a direct path.
So now at MIT, when you get there, where did you focus on? Because transportation is very vast, from procurement to all different functions within transport. Where did you start, and has that changed over the years?
Weirdly, it hasn't changed. So when you're doing your PhD, you look for a topic. And the topic that kind of fell into my lap was, how should shippers and carriers work together running this new thing called an RFP? Because at that time, in the early 90s, they weren't doing it. It was really strange negotiation. People don't realize when it was regulated, carriers essentially had monopolies on geographic areas. There was the rule of 8. You could only set up contracts with 8 shippers. There's all these restrictions that got lifted, and the market had to settle. And so my dissertation topic was using combinatorial auctions for shipper-carrier relationships, how to run RFPs using newfangled, at that point, optimization. And so what we tried to solve was, how do shippers and carriers work together? Because brokers were a 4-letter word at that time in the industry. No one used a broker. They were the provider of last resort, right? The 90s through the early 2000s. And so my dissertation dealt with using combinatorial optimization, which means a carrier, instead of bidding on one lane at a time, they can bid in packages or sets, and you'd win them all or nothing, because one of the underlying fundamentals that make truckload transportation different from almost any other heavily used mode is they have strong economies of scope, not economies of scale. What I mean by that, if I have a load from A to B, it helps me and lowers my price if I have something from B to somewhere else. The backhaul, forehaul, that's all manifested as economies of scope. As opposed to scale, which you know this as well as I do, for a shipper buying transportation contract, there is no economy of scale. A large shipper will pay usually more than a smaller one because they have a more expansive network. So economies of scope is what I tried to focus on. How do you leverage those economies of scope to have shippers and carriers work better together? So short answer and long answer, the hypothesis was you let carriers bid on packages. And that sounded great. I won a couple awards, published stuff, and then we put it into practice at a company called PTCG that became logistics.com, and it failed miserably. And there's a reason why no one does combinatorial or package bids as much in this space anymore, because carriers don't bid on packages. They don't understand it because they're not as reliable. And if they do bid on it, they tend not to win because individual carriers will bid lower on each of the individual lanes. And if they do bid on it, do win, it never materializes as they expect it. So there's too much uncertainty. So my whole dissertation was based on this idea of using combinatorial auctions, failed miserably. But to do combinatorial auction, to do a package bidding, you have to have optimization that enables you to do non-financial trade-offs in the objective function and kind of bring things in and out, and side constraints. And that is the golden goose. That's what really helps auctions run. And that's what's being used today. So unintended benefit is that you have these optimization-based procurement tools that came out of trying to get something else done. And that's really where I'm still working on today.
What are the side constraints that you just talked about?
You can have anything you want. So for example, a common one is I only want 20 carriers. I want to make sure that my minority carriers get at least 15% of my business. I want to make sure that I have a national carrier out of every hub. Something that is a yes, no. That's a side constraint. Something in what's known as the objective function of your optimization, you can make trade-offs such as if this carrier is an incumbent carrier on this lane or out of this facility, discount their price in the model by 7%, 4%, whatever. So therefore now I'm making a trade-off non-financial. So we see this all the time when shippers do bids with truckload and intermodal together. They might disfavor intermodal a little bit because it has longer lead times. Those things, they don't want to restrict it, but they want to do a trade-off. And so that's common. So you have economic trade-offs with non-financial factors, and then you have side constraints, things you want to force to happen.
And so on top of being an executive director at MIT, you're also the chief data scientist at DAT?
I have to correct that. I'm actually the chief scientist at DAT. So I was part of Chainalytics, great company, which is no longer here. Part of it, the piece that I started at Chainalytics was the benchmarking side. That got split and sold to DAT almost 5 years ago, almost to the day, right? Right as the pandemic hit. And when I was at Chainalytics, I was chief scientist. That's how Mike Kilgore, who's the CEO, claimed the role because I was actually here at MIT full-time. So it was a nice auxiliary role. The marketing team got really excited at one point and changed my title and added the word data in the middle, not knowing that a data scientist is something very specific that I am not. I'm a civil engineer, right? But marketing, it lives forever now. But I'm the chief scientist at DAT working on the shipper side, mainly working with the team. The tool that was bought as part of the Chainalytics acquisition has certainly the mathematics and the models have really improved and the UI, everything is better. But that's kind of where I work, helping shippers better procure transportation.
I'm curious to get your thoughts. How has a benchmarking tool, in your opinion, changed the swing and how dramatic market shifts go, or the speed at which carriers either reclaim price or shippers cut price? Do you think these benchmarking tools have, from when you started in 96, dramatically changed the landscape of these market shifts?
It's funny. I think visibility is the big thing, whether it's benchmarking or just seeing current rates, what's going now, or having just the ability to see a load board. We have more signals about our data. And so the big thing that I think it has done, and you've seen more of this, is people understand the relationship a little better. And so, like I said before, brokers were a 4-letter word. When I ran bids from like 96 to mid 2000s, and I probably did 100 bids for large, usually Fortune 500s, Fortune 100s. And back then, you would assign it based on low cost, and you'd adjust it to make some optimal. You want to make sure you knew the carriers and all that kind of stuff. But brokers were never assigned. And that became something that you started doing because people have realized that, yes, RFPs are important, having a contract rate. But if anyone's working this business, they know that the contracts are not binding in volume that the shipper is going to provide or the capacity that the carrier will provide. They're binding in price, but not in capacity or volume. And the reason for that is because it's so unpredictable. It's dynamic over time and over space, the geographies, and it's very fluid. And so what's happened that I think is we have better visibility. So people are understanding the nature of this market better. And that's why brokerage makes more sense for certain lanes. I'm sure we'll talk about segmentation, but one of the big ahas is you shouldn't put everything through an RFP. Back when I was running bids, we did for Fortune 20 companies, and if they had one load on a lane last year, it got a contract rate next year bid. So you'd have 15,000 lanes. if you look at any shipper's network, 80% of their volume goes on less than 20%. Usually it's 15% of their lanes. And so why are you using a contract for those high volume lanes and the same mechanism for these tails where you have 2 a year? And so what the big revelation has been that you need to segment and use differently. The challenge is to get a company to be comfortable with dynamic rates. So RFPs are not going away. They're a pain, but they work. 80 to 90% of all volume, regardless of where we are in the cycle, goes contract because everybody wants stability, consistency. Lanes that are not consistent, let them go dynamic. Whether you use APIs or other mechanisms, it's just a better way to secure those. So now going back to the thing you asked me, what is better visibility doing? I think it's going to dampen the cycles. My hypothesis, and we have a project going on up here at MIT, is that these cycles start because of an event. Something happens. The pandemic is the obvious one. People forget the first 2 months of the pandemic, volume was way down and carriers were protesting at the White House about brokers stealing all their money. They got very quiet once the demand shot up. So the whole idea is you've got a demand spike causes this. Sometimes you can have it like with the ELD mandate and the hours of service change, that kind of constricts supply, but that's coupled with some economic increases that drive demand up. And then the rest of the cycle is simply the capacity coming back out of the system. So I think that better information would lead to a dampening. And we're seeing that now. We've been in a inflationary market for the last 24 months, but it's been very slow. We only recently, at the end of Q4 2024, did we reach the same year-over-year change to turn positive. So it took a long time to bleed out the pandemic capacity that came into the market.
I often challenge people. They'll say, and I've been through freight cycles going back to 2004 from the asset side to the brokerage side. While everybody says we're in a recession, it almost feels like it's a reset. I know it by definition it is a recession, but would it ever, not say never, but the black swan event that happened in 2020, 2021, it feels like we're just getting more into a normal freight cycle.
I would tend to agree with you. I think what we saw is the last cycles, especially the pandemic cycle, all humans have recency bias. So we look at what happened the last 2 years, right, from Q1 2020 to 2022 was best market ever for a carrier, worst market for a shipper. But the next, 3 years almost have been just a drop. Really, if you look at the rates, there was a drop and then it leveled. And it's been like an elbow and it's been crawling up since about Q2 2023. That's a lot of time. And I agree. It's kind of like coming out of a trench. It's not like a sudden peak. And I just see things tightening. We always look at the difference between spot and contract on national average, the spot premium ratio, and it's right around zero for dry van, right around zero, a little negative for reefer. Flatbed's wacky, so I don't even want to talk about it. And intermodal is right there too.
You said something when you started on your dissertation, and we still at times see, is lane aggregation, does it actually work? So in a bid cycle, should a shipper aggregate volumes based on either 3-digit markets, 4 or 5-digit, or does that just not work?
We had a master's thesis to look at this, and so it's really a function of the length of haul. So if I'm going from the East Coast to the West Coast, which is kind of why you do truckload for that, you got other reasons. You can have a bigger origin region and destination region. If I'm going 300 miles, then it's got to be pretty tight. And so it's really a function of that, because as soon as you make the destination of the lane like a state, in like California as your destination, there's so much variability you're putting into the carrier if they're going to do a bid for that. And so there's rules of thumb you can do, but generally I wouldn't aggregate beyond 3-digit zips or KMAs, depending on how you set that up. But going more than that, you're trying to fool the carrier into thinking that it's a higher volume than it is. That's why most people aggregate, right? And so what I'm saying, if it's really low volume, it's low volume. Treat it like a dynamic rate and don't set a contract for it.
So for us, we're primarily in packaging, and we do hundreds of millions of dollars of loads of cans, glass, and aluminum. But one of the things we noticed during the pandemic was out of orbit shipments. So shipments coming from a plant, not planned, coming down to supply a customer that the local plant could not do. So we were pulling either further, and trailer utilization, I think, went down. So the amount of space in the trailer getting freight went down, and more low volume, infrequent shipments happen that were unplanned. So, and a lot of times they were unplanned STOs or stock transfer orders, or just support in general. And you brought something up. So a question I get all the time, and I think it's changed quite a bit. Is there a volume cutoff that you say, is it 50 loads or less? Is it 36 loads or less? That says, hey, don't put this on a routing guide no matter what. And I guess the second part to that is, if they don't do that, how do they budget for it?
Most people use volume as a cutoff. If you talk to a carrier, they'll say 50, which they mean one a week. And if you talk to most shippers, they'll go anywhere from 12 to 25. The real problem there, volume isn't what you want to use. It's consistency. We've looked at this a lot. And so if you look at the consistency of the volume, that's what matters more. Because we all have these lanes that have high volume, but they all happen in 3 weeks, right? Or they happen just a half the year, different, something like that. And that doesn't help you. It's consistency of volume. So, and I did a study and looked at a bunch of different shippers, and we found that consistency and volume, if you look at that, are only correlated about a 0.56, I think it was. So they're not as correlated as you think they are. So it's better to do consistency, but it's just easier to look at the total volume last year, right? And divide by 52. But I think consistency is what you want to do. So where do you cut it off? I think anything realistically 26 and lower, I think you should probably not bid. But I've seen some do it to 12.
So there's a low correlation to your point. I have a lot of shippers that during bottling season, they're moving tons, and the lane they have 150 loads, but almost all of them move in Q2, Q3. And there's nothing Q4. So do you look at that and say it either has to have a load in one of the 4 quarters or a load in each month?
Paper packaging and it is interesting because it's a very different business. I'm just looking at some numbers that I have at DAT, and it runs about 27 to 30% spot on average, as opposed to, say, a retail, which runs about half that, 15%, because it's very different. If I'm doing packaging materials, it's not a high value item, right? You're not shipping iPhones. And so what we see is that the average rate per mile is below the average anyway, just for the industry, because you have looser requirements for when you can ship and when you have to receive. Generally, they have slightly easier requirements. And so they have more spot used to it, which means they have a little more volatility. But you asked a question earlier about, okay, if I do dynamic, how do I budget for that? Great question. We had a project that looked at this. And so the funny thing is, it's probably 70, 80% of your lanes, but it's probably 20% of your volume. I mean, Pareto is everywhere, right? And so people get fixated on it, but you can bracket it. So you look at those lanes, and the thing is, the probability that the same volume will happen on those lanes is close to zero. There are going to be other lanes will pop up. And so it's not like a lane that has 2 a year. That same lane will have 2 a year every year. It's constantly moving around. So if you can look at the volume total you have, and then you can bracket what you expect the market to be, and there's enough things. You can talk to DAT where we think the market's going. If you look at it being a 2 to 3% rise, you can put brackets around it. And so you can try to budget it that way. And I've seen some shippers do that. I think it's a matter of getting people comfortable with having the dynamic tendering process in place. And so companies like Newell Rubbermaid does a really good job. They've talked publicly about this. They have a application they call a Thunderdome, and you have a dynamic rate, but you have a set of carriers who have already been pre-approved and they're being evaluated. So it's not like you're throwing it out to the open market. You're doing it in a contained way. So you can actually use multiple carriers, multiple providers, and they provide the competition to keep the guardrails on. Because what a CPO or any kind of finance officer, if you say, well, it's going to do dynamic pricing, their head starts spinning because they think it's going to go whatever it's going to be. When in fact, even if you had a contract rate, it probably won't hold anyway. Anything under like 20 loads a year, the acceptance ratio drops tremendously.
I see a lot of them struggle with this, and I don't know how I feel about the dynamic. So we have some that say, all right, you've been allotted. And in the downturn, when we came down in 22, 23, on the back half into 23, they would say 70% of the lane, we're going to agree to your contract rate. But the other 20 to 30, we're going to dynamically quote it. If the dynamic quotes all come in higher, we'll tender to you. If the dynamic quotes come back in later, then you can get it on the spot market that way. It was kind of an interesting way of testing the market and moving. And some came up with rules. We'd apply a 3% rate increase if after a quarter dynamic was always higher. On the other side, we do. So I guess I'm curious, from when you started looking at routing guides, and you've done over 100 RFPs, how do you summarize dynamic quoting? If I'm a shipper, should I use it? How do you properly use it? And I guess last, do you see a downside to it?
The reason why we have routing guides originally is just because we had no intelligence in the operational execution stage. All the intelligence, all the smart was in the bid. You spend hours and do 32 different scenarios, and you spend months doing this. You have scalpel, and then you throw it into a routing guide, which is a wood chipper. And so it says this lane, this carrier, this rate. And so that works. For high volume lanes, it works. It works incredibly well. And if you have EDI, which everyone hates, but it works incredibly well once it's set up, right? You don't need to have API for a lot of these high volume lanes because it just works. The problem is that tail, that long tail. So how do you handle those? There will always be a problem. And so the question, it's a matter of trade-offs. You can go through the contracting process knowing that 80% of the lanes, the contracts won't hold because the carrier won't have anything there if it's 2 a year. Or you can set up a mechanism. And I've seen mechanisms from where you go out to 6, name the number 8, whatever, brokers who are pre-assigned, and they have other business that you have. Or they might be someone you're trying out via a trial period, and it's made visible for them immediately. And so they can all respond back with a rate, and then the shipper decides from that. Now, this isn't for all of it. And what you pointed out was they're saying, okay, up to this level goes contract rate. Above that, we'll do whatever we want, which is exactly what every carrier does when the market's tighter. You say, you said 5, 2 a week. I do 2 a week. If there's more than that, I might charge you more. So, it works both ways, and that's okay. That's okay. I think you want to treat the consistent volume differently than your more dynamic volume and treat that differently. I remember working with Sears back in the late 90s when Roger Will was running it, and they had tiered pricing. So if it was up to certain volume, you get this rate. A little higher volume, you get a slightly higher rate. And the challenge is the TMS has to be very sophisticated because you have to track how many things have gone. And they also got guaranteed, they had brokerage rights. So they had to cover the load, but they could broker it out. And so there's all that tied together, but it kind of collapsed under its own weight because it was hard to do a bid where every lane had 3 rates essentially from every carrier. It just kind of got hard to manage because carriers, if they go through and bidding, all those tiers just started collapsing. But it was a clever idea at the time.
Some it still works. In a way, do you think it kind of the economies of scope and scale?
So think a lane. I've got a lane. And if I have 1 a day, you're going to price that very differently than if I have 5 on Friday, right? And so consistency is what really matters because then you can rely on it being there. And so you've got to ask yourself from a carrier's perspective, what do I want to see? And that's really what should drive, what's the best mechanism for that?
You said something, you guys got into a war room. You do an RFP, so you got that strategy. And I'm curious if you had any advice for shippers. You talked about scenarios, and I know there's probably a ton of different scenarios. Are there certain things that if I'm a shipper doing my bid, what scenarios should I be running? Are there any common things that you should look at?
Now, I haven't done a bid in a couple decades, right? I will work with people who've done, but the one thing you shouldn't do is the first run you do is find my low cost. And whatever that is, never, ever show that to anyone because that becomes your new target, right? And so that's the lowest cost. Every carrier gets 1 lane and it's just insane. It's crazy. So I think the most common scenarios I see are favoring incumbents or what happens more in tighter markets, you do a pre-bid to them. You say, okay, incumbents, you've got these lanes. I'm willing to give a 1.5%, whatever increase and just take that out of the bid. And so that's good for them because again, consistency, and it's good for you because you don't have to submit to the market. Now you'll only do that if you think the rate's going to come back higher, right? And so it works both ways. So the scenarios that favor incumbents. And then after that, any other kind of commitments you have, there's some for whether it's sustainability, there's things for a minority buy, women-owned industry. So whatever the commitments of the company are, you can enforce those in. And what you're doing is you're making it more business optimal rather than mathematically optimal because we know the lowest cost solution isn't that feasible. You'll have a lot of turnover and it just doesn't make sense. So you can try to position so that it looks like a reasonable solution that it seems doable. So you have different scenarios you can run. However, every time you do a side constraint or force a trade-off, your real costs in the planned costs will go up. They will never go down. They can't go down. It's a mathematical impossibility because you're adding constraints to it. So you're always giving back. And so I see the give back can be anywhere from 5% to 10%. And the idea is you're not really giving back. You're just getting more comfortable that that's what you're going to actually spend. Because I've done one bid, and I won't name the consultancy who was doing it. We were working for them for a company. They took the lowest cost carrier on every lane, and that was their solution. This was way back in the late 90s. And it was just insane because it failed spectacularly 3 months later because the carrier said, what? You gave me 10 loads. One is over here, one's over here, and 2 are next. Oh, come on.
Well, I remember back, and I got into transport in the early 2000s, and we had 300 to 400 trucks. We're mostly tier 1 automotive, but we did a lot of general OTR freight. And I remember when we would get the bids, I would bid every lane as a backhaul. And the problem was when they awarded us the backhaul, we were never there. And a lot of times 2 people would come to us and say, man, if I give you these 20 loads in this lane, would you give me a discount? I think what you said about economies of scope and scale from the asset side matters so much.
This is one of the few commodities that have the economies of scope, and there's actually diseconomies to scale on a lane. And the way I convince people of this is if I have loads going from Chicago to Miami, let's say 2 a week, and I suddenly say, you're going to get 10 a week now. Aren't you happy? Give me a discount. It's like, no, because now I've got 8 more carriers. I got to get out of Florida. You can't do it. So yeah, it's very different. And I make this presentation, I've been doing it for years, that there are no economies of scale to buying truckload transportation. And I get challenged every time. I have a chart that shows the size of the carrier and their average cost per mile. And if there are economies of scale, it would be going down from left to the right. And it doesn't. It goes the opposite.
Especially early on, a lot of our lanes are high volume, very dense, good consistency. But when certain asset providers are put on lanes and the volume goes up to 15, 20 a day from on a short haul, 340 mile band, less than 400, you're dumping so many assets. The deadhead adds up. And then the efficacy, like the trucks, they lose utilization. It just goes down and you lose money.
It's a really great point, Andrew. So a cost for a truck going from A to B in the morning is different from the 10th one that goes that day. So this is something that, how do I set that up in contracts? That's hard because for a contract, you're assuming the average. But for spot, you'll pay more for that 10th truck. And so I think spot or the dynamic rates is more reflective of the true costs. And so that's why for those things above what you committed to, go to spot.
When you look at a shipper, how do you measure the efficacy of your efforts in an RFP? Do you have anything that you, like if you go to talk to somebody or you're doing a study on anybody, is there something that says, hey, this RFP worked? Is there such a thing to do that?
Yeah. The dirty little secret is most shippers don't keep the results of their bid. They put them in the routing guide, but the routing guide's a living document. And so mini bids just keep populating. It's very hard for many shippers to say, what did we bid? And compare that. Now, there are some that are really good out there, and you look at this, but every carrier knows. They know the yield, right? They said, okay, they said 10 a week, and they've been giving us 2, or they've been giving us 20. And so they track that really closely. And some shippers do. Most, to be honest, don't. But you can measure the efficacy of a routing guide, because that's really all that a bid is doing. It's populating the routing guide. And so how the efficacy of the routing guide is a good indicator of that.
So we've been through the market. It just seems more crazy today than it's ever been. So when I first got in the industry in the early 2000s, you had your normal seasons. We did have the fuel spike in 07, recession in 09, but then you get into the vortex in 13, 14, the bad industrial production 16, then you had the trade war, and then you're into 19, then we're in COVID. But now it just seems like more pronounced. The swings go up and down. As we start to settle back into a more normal kind of year from a transport perspective, and you think about routing guides, is there anything, if I'm a shipper this year, I know it's going to go up between anywhere from single digits probably. Is there anything I can do from either, do I ratio split? Do I do straight waterfall? Do I do a mix of API? And do I remove ghost lanes? Like, what do you think are some things to beat this?
You have been talking to Angie because you mentioned ghost lanes. Yeah.
We talked about it. It's very interesting because every bid you get awarded, we had one, we got awarded like $10 million award, 5 of it shipped.
5 million or 5 loads?
5 million. So
Yeah, it's what happened. Because shippers, to forecast what your volume is going to be per week on a lane is next to impossible. So you use last year, but the years don't always repeat. And that's why they only repeat on the really high volume lanes. You can look at the consistency based on the volume of the previous year, and that's pretty tight, but you get a lot of volatility.
do you think ratio splitting lanes is a good method, or a straight waterfall, or a primary?
It's a really good point. So a waterfall, just for anyone listening, is you go to the primary, and then if they reject it, you have a bunch of other carriers that are alternate. The alternates usually, no one says this, but they're the carriers that bid on a lane and they lost, right? So there's no commitment. And so I've worked with some shippers that go down to the 15th backup. I think that those days are dead. I think after 2, you go to spot. You go to some other dynamic solution because you're already going to be dynamic. I mean, you're kidding yourself saying, okay, alternates, they're contracted. Yeah, no, they're not. They don't have a commitment. I don't know any shipper that penalizes a backup carrier for not taking a load.
We probably have 2 or 3 contracts where they'll call it SRG freight.
SRG.
Standard routing guide freight. You have to take a certain chunk. It's like, and you know you're never going to win on them.
It's crazy. So I think what we're seeing more and more is that you go to dynamic rates, because spot's a 4-letter word, right? Literally. And so after the primary, or maybe one alternate doesn't take it, to save time, just to go out, and we're having better mechanisms. Remember I said before that wood chipper that is the routing guide? Now more intelligence is being moved to operations. The systems are better now, and that's why you can do some of this. And whether it's API or other mechanism, you introduce competition at the load level for this, and you have a better, faster results.
If I'm a shipper, have you spent much time looking at the algorithms and the API quoting?
No, this is the great thing, because the big challenge here, well, first, it's coming already. Some have it, some do it well, some do it poorly. But I've heard stories on both sides where they're tweaking the model. Sometimes it's too conservative and they win no freight, or they make it too aggressive and they win a boatload that they can't handle. So it's early days. It's early days to do this, but it is very doable. Some companies are doing it quite well. It's going to come. It just makes sense for certain volume lanes, at least generating something that a person can then say, yeah, okay, and make an adjustment on. But an instant recommendation, absolutely.
We probably do 4,000 to 5,000 a month loads, just API.
API, just to make sure we're talking the same thing, is just a measure of connectivity. You could have monkeys on the end, typing in number.
Yeah. So we have algorithms and data scientists on the backside setting the formula.
Hopefully, if you use something like reinforcement learning, it's learning. Because I talked to one shipper, I won't mention the name, but so they have like 6 providers, have to feed things in, and they just let the winner know. And they don't provide any feedback to the other. So it takes away the learning. And so the question is, how can you make a carrier or someone responding back to this auto generation be better? And you've got to show them when they fail as well as when they win.
That's a really good point. We have a partner that does that, sends it back, and you can see, because otherwise the model is going to blindly go down by a certain percentage or threshold based on market dynamics. So it's kind of interesting to see how it's changed it. When you think of time of year, if I'm a shipper, do you think, we talked about this at the beginning, should you do January? Should you do end of year? I mean, does it matter when you do it, in your opinion?
My opinion is it doesn't matter. Although the pandemic threw everything out, you could look. Previously, I used to look at this, and for one shipper at a time, you see their cycle. We're able to track what is the new rate differential. We see when new rates are coming in. And so you can look at that as a proxy when a bid comes in, right? And when a bunch of new rates on lanes show up, and it used to look like clockwork. You'd see new rate in, and then it go down, and then a year later, you'd see them all come in. During the pandemic, it looked like city skylines. It's like new rates constantly coming in. Now we're settling back down, and I think we'll see again that we're hitting into a cycle. Because I get asked a lot, well, RFPs dead? Because they're a pain. They take forever getting the data together and all this. And what's interesting, you have all these tools that make it easier, but people spend the same amount of time. I like to call it the vacuum cleaner complex, where when the vacuum was introduced, it was supposed to save time for cleaning, and all it did was increase the standard of cleanliness. Same thing with word processors. Remember, we're probably of the same age where I had whiteout, and you're typing, you white out, and it was acceptable to have something crossed out and written. That was okay. You can't do that now. You've got to redo it, because the level technology, if it makes it easier to do something, the standard of what's acceptable just keeps going up. So people take the same amount of time running scenarios and analysis of bids as they did back when I was running it initially in the late 90s.
Remember the spreadsheets?
Oh, God, yes. I remember coding in VBA the spreadsheets behind to do checking. We used to call it the bid response and analysis tool, the BRAT. You help a carrier respond to your bid because it was so complicated.
I thought I saw you did something on the monitoring effects of supplier service model and market dynamic with Angie maybe. Did relationships matter in transportation?
You have to say yes, but it's changed. It's changed. So I got in this industry in the mid 90s, 95, 96, right? And I started running bids right away. That's what I did for the first 6 years, using the stuff that I did in my dissertation, applying it. And a relationship back then, except for companies like Walmart, there's more companies like that now, was dinner, sports tickets, all these kind of things. And that was the relationship. And now the relationship is how can you help me do my job better? So yes, it's very relationship oriented, but it's very in my opinion, very problem solving. Yes, there's still dinners to be had and all of that. And the social, it helps smooth the relationship over. But I had a good friend who is a chief purchasing officer in procurement. And he pretty much said, relationships are for your spouse, not for this. And the whole idea, don't name your farm animals. There's some of that too, because if I'm selling, I want to have a relationship because you're probably going to value my relationship a little more. I might be able to get some rent, but it's there because carriers and brokers can help shippers do their job better. That's the relationship that I think has the most value now.
I took all packaging shippers and I compared 5 of them in the period of 22, 23 in the same mileage band. So I did 300 mileage band, 400 or less in the mileage band, and ones that had great loyalty, meaning the lanes didn't have churn. We kept them. And they had great consistency and density. Their cost during the spike in 21, 22 was very flat. The other ones that had constant carrier churn and change and spot market, it was crazy to watch the up and down. So I think on some level, like on high density, high volume lanes, I think it matters. And I think having partners that are dense with your network matter.
I agree. There's two, relationships kind of get thrown out depending on how high we are or low we are in the market. But there's 2 schools of thought. One is what you just described. Your relationship, kind of keep that steady state. The other is ride the wave. And it's like, I know I'm going to pay more when the market gets tight, but I'm paying way less when the market is loose. And there's companies that I won't name that's their strategy. Find every penny, get every penny. I know when the market turns, I'm going to pay a little more, but I'm saving more in the down markets.
I think that downside in 21 made a lot of people think twice.
Fair. So the whole idea, now it's you got shipper friendly or my carrier friendly. And you can say whichever way it is, you can tell where the market is or who's calling who, right? During the first 2 years of the pandemic, it was shippers calling carriers. But that flipped, right? In 22, mid 22. And then carriers were calling, hey.
I remember I spoke on a panel down at a conference and everybody's like, yeah, it's just such a great market. And I said, I promise you this much. It's flipping very fast. Like shippers are coming. It's not in that great state. You can see it on the spot market. Although in this early part of this year, we've seen the spot market go. There's a lot going on there.
Well, it's funny. In the end of December and January, we saw the spot market really pump up. It flattened out in February. We saw it go right back down in contract rates too. So I think there was some weather related things. But what's funny is you look at the last 3 cycles. Yeah, the pandemic was crazy. But if you separate out and you look at what I was talking before, that spot premium ratio, how far that gets, the pandemic was actually not as bad, not as high as what happened during the 2016, 2020, the ELD mandate cycle, or the one before that, hours of service. They're kind of comparable. It wasn't quite as bad. It's just the spot year over year just went through the roof during the pandemic because demand, we've never seen. It wasn't that just total demand increased. Locations changed. And so everything became sparse. You talk to a manufacturer, you must have seen this. They're shipping from the factory to a customer. And so OTIF drove it too, because do I release it today even though I only have half the load? Or do I pay the penalty for late and I deliver in full? And most people will rather be on time.
On time. I call it no more OTIF. Like we dropped the if. Like it did not matter. So I guess I have a couple more things. What do you think if I'm a shipper and I'm thinking about 25? What should I expect? So you said at DAT and at MIT, what do you think?
Right now, the market has been in a trough, right, since spring of 23, but it's been steadily tightening. for whatever reason. And so I think it's going to continue like that, barring any, I can't think of what a spike in demand would be that would drive it like the pandemic. So I think we're going to see, I'd say, 2 to 5% increase contract rates over the course of the year. The other big thing that's happened, the last couple cycles, when you have a big market swing up or down, it squashes seasonality. It just wipes it out. Seasonality is coming back. And I think what we saw in January, that little bad weather peak, that's normal, except for cycle years. And so we're going to see that again. I think the reintroduction of seasonality is going to happen. But I see a steady tightening, I'm equilibrium. And the challenge, once you're in equilibrium, it doesn't take a lot to tip it over one way or the other, but I do not see a spike on par with the pandemic or the previous cycle happening.
Carriers' operating ratios were unbelievable. I mean, the past 3 years. I mean, now it's getting back to a normal OR, but still tough.
And it's funny because here at DAT, we work with shippers, carriers, and brokers. The last 2 years have been awesome if you're a shipper. And it's a freight recession and a bloodbath if you're a carrier or a broker. But the previous 2 years, it was just the opposite.
Procurement teams were all-stars past 2 years. They were just knocking it out. Real quick, what's the MicroMasters program?
So the MicroMasters program has been around since 2015. It's a program that was established at MIT where we'd have online classes that people could take. I mean, I created the one in supply chain management. It consists of 5 courses that go from analytics to fundamentals to dynamics to systems and design. And if you complete all those, each course is 12 weeks long and has content on it and videos and it's very interactive. You get a credential from MIT. And the courses, it's all free for the material if you want to just watch the videos and learn the concepts. If you want to get credentialized and get that credential, it's, I think, $300, $299, I think, a course. So it's pretty cheap. And it's the same things that we teach up here at MIT in the first semester of the supply chain management program. If you complete the whole credential and take this comprehensive final exam, you can apply to MIT and you can get the degree, the master's degree, in 5 months instead of the 10 months that it normally takes. So that's the blended program we call. And we're entering our, 2018 was the first class. So we're entering, our 7th class now. And usually we accept about 40 in that blended program and 40 in the full 10-month or residential program. Also, other schools accept the blended, the credential, and they give you credit for that. So we've had over 1 million, I think 1.2 million course registrations since we started. So 195 different countries. So it's pretty incredible. I have a great lead. Dr. Eva Ponce runs this and she does a fantastic job. But we have people from all over the world taking these courses.
That's awesome. That sounds great. I love that. Well, thanks again. I love your work. You guys do a lot of good stuff up there.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap for More Than a Broker. You heard firsthand accounts from industry experts and Spot's hardworking individuals revealing a culture of collaboration and innovation. For more information about Spot, our service offerings, our people and culture, our job postings and more, check us out online at spotinc.com. That is spotinc.com. Thank you for listening and for being part of this journey. Until next time, keep striving to be more than a broker.